And then I will be the spiritual leader in Israel. And how is he going to do that? I'll tell you exactly how. He went and saw a witch. That's how. That was later, I understand that, but not much later. That's where you end up. Jonathan goes to David and he makes things right. Now, let's go ahead and finish up this morning, because I think we can make our point without having... It's made all through the text. Samuel died in chapter 25. And then we see what happened when the armies of the Philistines fought against Israel. But chapter 31, and there's a lot of material here that deals with David. Chapter 31 and verse 1, Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines followed hard upon Saul and his sons. And the Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, Saul's sons. The battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. Now Saul commits suicide. That's a real shame. It's a real tragedy, because it would have never happened. It would never have happened. And by the way, it's not me stating things hypothetically. I'm just telling you, if Saul had surrendered to God's plan and God's will for his life, and he'd just given the kingdom to David and served him, Saul could have been using a victory here. He really could have. And David would have never been defeated this way, because he had God's power in his life. This would not have happened. And now, not only is there great destruction in Saul's household, there's great destruction in Israel. And the whole nation is in turmoil and uproar, and they're in defeat. I want to remind you, Christian, that we do not live in a vacuum. Praise the Lord for a Jonathan, that in spite of his father's reaction, he was not able to be destroyed. If anyone should have been a rebellious teenager, if anyone should have turned out to hate his parents, if anyone should have turned out living for the devil based upon circumstances, that's Jonathan. Jonathan, his life wasn't fair, my friend. And yet, he just dies. And I think it's tragic. Matter of fact, chapter 31 is a chapter where I start bawling my eyes out when I read 1 Samuel. I just cry. I just cry when I see Jonathan die. It's not fair. Jonathan didn't deserve to get killed because of his father's sin. But he did. And I always think, couldn't God have spared Jonathan and let him serve with David? He would have. There's no question about Jonathan's character in that matter. Matter of fact, think how much better things would have been when Israel and Judah really united, when David's family kind of came together with the rest of the nation of Israel. If Jonathan had been there, they could have just done it so peaceably. There wouldn't have had to be the Abner-Joab conflict, and just a lot of things that Saul could really have, or that Saul's son Jonathan could really have worked things. And sometimes I start thinking hypothetically, and I think, well, what if Jonathan had not been killed? God certainly could have spared his life. God certainly could have spared Jonathan's life here. And he didn't. And so I want to say some things to you about that in conclusion this morning. I think they'll be helpful to us if we'll look at them from the right perspective. I asked myself, why didn't God spare Jonathan? Why didn't God spare Jonathan? And there's two ways you can react to it. You can say, well, God really could have used Jonathan. He could have really done something with that young man. And Jonathan didn't deserve to be killed. He wouldn't have fought David. He would have fought with David. He always did. No question where his loyalty lay, was there. He was loyal to his father and he was loyal to David, and he was able to do both. And if that wasn't a complicated situation, things would have been easy between him and David. And he could have just been such a diplomat, and he could have been so greatly used. And I want to just tell you something. Somebody along the line somewhere would have tried to make one of Jonathan's sons king of Israel. And because his father's sin was so extensive, Jonathan needed to be exterminated. And that's just a fact. If Jonathan had not been killed in battle, by the way, good way to go for him. Jonathan just never anything about his character. He died fighting. And probably wasn't sorry about it at all. I just feel so sorry for him. Don't you? It doesn't just tear your heart out. And you know what happens when you start feeling sorry for Jonathan? You start to feel like God was wrong. You really do. Why did God have to reject? God's the one that made the decision to reject Jonathan because of Saul's sin. Why didn't God just deal with Saul? If he'd have killed him, Jonathan would have instantly been king. Right? You think about it, and then and there was nothing that disqualified Jonathan personally. And you get a little confused, and what happens is if you begin to think along these lines, you can come up with answers for what God could have done that would have been better than what God did. You say, Pastor, you're starting to say things that you shouldn't say. Well, we shouldn't. But I'm telling you, when you have bitterness in your heart, you're thinking things that you shouldn't think. I'm just telling you. You think about this with me for a second, Christian. Be honest about it. When you feel as though things are not as they should have been, the honest truth of it is that you think it's God's fault. If you believe this morning that Jonathan should not have been killed because of his father's sin, you don't think God's fair? You say, well, Pastor, I wouldn't make that statement. I wouldn't say that. No, but if you're bitter about anything in life, if you're bitter about anything in your life, it's the same thing. You have bitterness in your heart? Is there something in your heart where you just feel as though if things had happened differently, then I never would have, and the only reason I'm in this position is because God... And you wouldn't say it that way. I mean, you just say, well, this person did this and this and this. And yes, I'm bitter, but I'm not bitter at God. I'm bitter at... Friend, you're bitter at God. You really are. You know the thing that helps me to be able to resolve this thing with Jonathan? I still cry about Jonathan. I really do. I cry when I read 1 Samuel. I'm a real crybaby on this book of the Bible. It's just so sad. You know what helps me? Jonathan was okay. He was all right. Jonathan's never troubled about any of this. Here we are, we're all upset about Jonathan, and we're crying for him, and you don't see him shedding any tears at all. You really don't. Look at 1 Samuel. Here is Jonathan, who's been wronged. And you could sit down and say, man, Jonathan, you've had a hard life. And he'd say, pardon? I don't follow you. Well, Jonathan, you should have been king of Israel. And he'd say, no. First of all, let me get something straight with you, pal. Israel shouldn't even have a king. God should be our king. Jonathan would have told you that. He really would have. I believe that. And you say, well, true, that's true, but, God did allow it. And because God allowed it, you didn't do anything wrong. You didn't deserve to be king. And Jonathan would have said, pardon me? Do you know what we're talking about here? We're talking about being in the line of the great deliverer of all mankind, the Messiah. So you don't understand here. Why would I deserve to be in the line of the Messiah? You say, well, I mean, you're a good man, Jonathan. He'd say, do you know David's a man after God's own heart? He says, David's a lot better man than I am. And I want to tell you something, friend, David really was. David really was. David had every bit as much opportunity to be a traitor to Jonathan as Jonathan did to him. Honestly. You ever thought about that? Jonathan was a good friend to David, but David was a good friend to Jonathan as well. There's probably only one man in Israel physically that could have killed Jonathan, and that was David. Physically speaking, Saul was a big, tough man, and everybody feared him. And Jonathan wasn't afraid of Saul. Jonathan went out and fought and killed hundreds, but I'm telling you, Saul killed his thousands and David killed his 10,000s. And the only person in the world that could have killed Jonathan was David, and Jonathan would have told you so. Jonathan would have said, God chose David to be king of Israel, and he was the rightful king. And he wouldn't have been upset about it. And you could have said, Jonathan, it's not fair that you had to lose in battle. And Jonathan would have said, well, I wouldn't like to lose anywhere else. It's not fair.